We were 3 days into our hiking trip, deep in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and reminds you how far you've traveled from city life. We had been following a loop trail that promised breathtaking views and solitude. Exactly what we were looking for. It was just me, my friend Danny, and the long stretch of uneven terrain ahead. The mornings were quiet, the afternoons were full of conversation, and the evenings were spent under the stars, exhausted but happy. On the third day, something strange happened. We were trudging up a slight incline when I saw her for the first time. An older woman, maybe in her 70s, came toward us on the trail. She was dressed like a typical hiker. Sturdy boots, a weathered backpack, and a brimmed hat that shielded her wrinkled face. Her steps were deliberate, steady, like she'd been doing this for years. As she got closer, she gave us a warm smile and said, "Oh, well, hello again." I glanced at Danny, who gave me a confused look. Hello again? I didn't recognize her. She didn't seem familiar at all. Maybe she'd mistaken us for someone else. Or maybe she was just one of those overly friendly hikers who liked to chat with everyone they passed. Either way, I smiled politely and said, "Hi." Danny just nodded and we kept walking. As soon as she was out of earshot, I muttered, "That was weird." "Yeah," Danny agreed, "but maybe she's just, old. People get mixed up sometimes." That seemed reasonable, so we didn't think much more about it. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully. The trail twisted and turned through dense forest, the kind where the trees seemed to close in around you, muffling sound. It was peaceful but also a little eerie in its isolation. About 30 minutes later, we rounded a bend and there she was again. The same woman. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone who looked like her. But no, it was definitely the same woman. Same hat, same backpack, same deliberate gait. This time, she didn't stop to talk. She just nodded and said a quick "hi" as she passed us, heading in the opposite direction once again. My stomach tightened. How was that possible? She'd been walking the other way earlier. There was no way she could have turned around, hiked past us without us noticing, and then come back. The trail wasn't that complicated. There were no shortcuts or alternate routes. Not here. It was a straightforward path. I glanced at Danny, and I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. We didn't say anything until she was out of sight. Then Danny whispered, "How the hell did she get there?" "I don't know," I said, my voice low. Maybe we're just imagining things. But I didn't believe that, and I don't think Danny did either. For the next few hours, we kept hiking, but the mood had shifted. We were both on edge, glancing over our shoulders, listening for footsteps. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. It wasn't just the strange encounter with the woman. It was the growing realization that we were completely alone out here. No cell service, no other hikers, nothing but miles of wilderness. When we stopped for lunch, we sat in silence for a while, chewing our sandwiches and staring at the trees. Finally, Danny said, "What if she's following us?" I shook my head. She wasn't following us. She was walking the other way, both times. "Yeah, but that's what doesn't make sense," he said. "How could she be going the other way both times?" I didn't have an answer. The whole thing felt impossible, like a glitch in reality. But I didn't want to dwell on it. The last thing we needed was to psych ourselves out. So I said, "Let's just keep going. If we see her again, we'll figure it out then." Danny nodded, but I could tell he wasn't reassured. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension never left. Every corner we turned, I half expected to see her again, but she didn't appear. By the time we made camp that evening, I was starting to convince myself that it had just been some weird coincidence. Maybe there was a side trail we hadn't noticed. Maybe we were overthinking it. That night, as we sat by the fire, Danny brought it up again. "What if she's still out there?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who cares?" I said, trying to sound casual. "She's just an old woman. She's not dangerous." "But how did she—" "Danny," I interrupted, "just drop it, okay? We'll never figure it out, so let's just forget about it." He didn't say anything after that, but I could tell he was still thinking about it. Hell, so was I. The next day, we packed up and started hiking again. The trail was getting steeper now, winding its way up the side of a mountain. The higher we climbed, the thinner the air felt, and the more my legs ached. But I didn't mind. The physical exertion helped take my mind off everything else. Around mid-morning, we reached a clearing with a spectacular view of the valley below. We stopped to catch our breath and take some pictures. As I was framing a shot of the mountains in the distance, I heard Danny say, "Oh, come on." I turned to see what he was looking at, and my heart sank. There she was again, the same woman walking toward us on the trail. This time, she didn't say anything. She just smiled faintly as she passed us, her eyes flicking between me and Danny like she was studying us. I couldn't even bring myself to say hi. I just stood there, frozen, until she disappeared around the next bend. This time, Danny didn't wait until she was out of earshot. "Okay, that's it," he said, his voice shaking. "This is bullshit. How is she doing this?" "I don't know," I said, my own voice unsteady. "But we need to keep moving. Let's just finish this loop and get out of here." We picked up the pace after that, practically jogging up the trail. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. But nothing made sense. She couldn't have gotten ahead of us without us seeing her. And how did she keep appearing on the trail like that, always coming toward us from the opposite direction? By the time we reached the highest point of the trail, we were both exhausted, physically and mentally. The air was thin up here, and the wind was cold. But at least we hadn't seen her again. I started to think that maybe she was finally gone. But then, as we began our descent, I spotted her one last time. She was standing at the edge of the trail, facing away from us, looking out over the valley. She didn't turn around as we approached. She didn't acknowledge us at all. She just stood there, perfectly still, her hat casting a shadow over her face. It was as if she was waiting for something, or someone. We didn't stop. We didn't say anything. We just kept walking, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. And when I finally mustered the courage to glance back over my shoulder, she was gone. That night, as we drove back to civilization, neither of us said a word. There was nothing to say. We had no answers, no explanation, no closure. Just the memory of an old woman who seemed to defy the rules of time and space. I haven't been hiking since. It was late summer when my friends and I decided to go hiking and camping at Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico. The place has this quiet, almost sacred air about it, tucked in among ancient ruins and dramatic cliffs. It's one of those spots where the history seems to cling to the rocks and the trees. I've always loved the outdoors, but something about Bandelier felt different from the start. Maybe it was the weight of knowing we were walking on land once inhabited by ancient Pueblo peoples, or the way the landscape shifted between peaceful and intimidating. My friend Sarah, the most level-headed person I know, came along. Sarah's the type who has her life together, good job, nice apartment, the whole deal. But she has this thing. She claims she can sense things. See things is how she puts it, though she never really elaborates. Normally, I'd be skeptical, but Sarah doesn't exaggerate or mess around. She wouldn't lie about something like that. So when she told us she could sense things that others couldn't, I believed her, even if I didn't entirely understand it. That night, we'd set out on a trail just before sunset. We weren't planning anything crazy, just a short hike to a nice overlook where we'd watch the stars come out. The air was crisp, and the orange and pink hues of the setting sun painted the cliffs in warm light. The trail twisted and climbed, cutting through dense patches of juniper and pinyon pine. It was quiet except for the sound of our boots crunching on the sandy path and the occasional bird calling in the distance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a shift. It wasn't cold, exactly, but the air seemed heavier. My chest tightened, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than I should have. It was irrational, I told myself. We were in a national park surrounded by nothing but nature. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. We were about halfway up the trail when it happened. The sun was gone, leaving just enough light to make out the outlines of the cliffs and trees around us. That's when we all heard it. A distinct crunch, like someone stepping on a dry twig, came from about 20 feet to our left, deep in the brush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but no deer or coyote would make that sound. It was deliberate, heavy. I turned to Sarah, my stomach churning. Her face was unreadable, but I noticed the way her hand tightened on her trekking pole. Without looking at me, she said, "Don't look back, just keep going. It's right there." Her voice was calm, too calm, like she was trying not to scare us. But her words had the opposite effect on me. My mouth went dry, and every instinct screamed at me to turn around and see what she meant. But I didn't. Her tone left no room for argument. Instead, I kept walking, my legs feeling like lead. I could hear the others' footsteps behind me, their pace quickening to match mine. My breathing felt shallow, and every crunch of gravel under my boots seemed deafening. I didn't dare look to the left, but I could feel it. Something. It wasn't like seeing or hearing it, but more like the air was charged, pressing in on me from that direction. My skin prickled, and I felt like I was being watched. No, not watched, studied. It didn't make sense. There was nothing there. I'd scanned the area before Sarah spoke, and I hadn't seen anything unusual. The trees were sparse enough that anything larger than a rabbit would have been visible. But my gut told me otherwise. The trail started to climb steeply, zigzagging up the side of a cliff. On one side was the rocky slope, and on the other a sheer drop into darkness. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, my hands gripping the straps of my backpack so tightly that my knuckles ached. Behind me, someone stumbled on a loose rock, muttering a curse under their breath. The sound startled me, and I almost turned around before catching myself. "Just keep going," Sarah said again, her voice a little firmer this time. She was right behind me, her tone steady, like she was trying to keep us all grounded. I wanted to ask her what she saw, what she thought was there, but I couldn't bring myself to break the silence. The crunching sound came again, louder this time, closer. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I knew it couldn't be a person. There was no light, no voices, no sign of anyone else on the trail. And yet, whatever it was moved with a purpose, mirroring our pace. I could feel it every time we paused to catch our breath. It would stop too, the silence stretching out like a thin wire ready to snap. At one point, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, low to the ground, darting between the trees. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to taste blood, and forced myself to keep walking. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the fading light and my frayed nerves. But deep down, I didn't believe that. By the time we reached the top of the cliff, the sky was fully dark, and the stars were out in full force. The view should have been breathtaking, but I barely noticed. My legs were shaking, and my body felt drained, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. The others looked just as rattled, their faces pale in the moonlight. No one said a word. We just stood there, catching our breath, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon below. I glanced at Sarah. She was staring back down the trail, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she turned to me and gave a small shake of her head. "It's gone," she said quietly. That was it. No explanation, no reassurance, just a simple statement. But the way she said it made me believe her. Whatever had been following us, it wasn't there anymore. We didn't linger. The hike back to camp was faster, almost frantic, like we couldn't get away from that place quickly enough. Even after we'd made it back to the safety of our tents, I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me all night, even as the others tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been an animal or just our imaginations. I didn't argue, but I knew they didn't believe it any more than I did. To this day, I don't know what it was. There was nothing supernatural about it, nothing overtly threatening, yet it was the most terrifying experience of my life. Maybe it was just the wilderness reminding us that we were out of our element, or maybe some things aren't meant to be understood. All I know is that I'll never forget the way the air felt that night, heavy and watchful, like the land itself was alive and aware of us. And I'll never go back to Bandelier, not after that. Camping with my Boy Scout troop was something I always looked forward to, but this trip was different. We had arrived at the campsite earlier in the day, set up our tents, and spent the afternoon hiking and cooking over the fire. The crisp mountain air carried the faint scent of pine, and the chatter of my troop filled the space around the campfire as the night settled in. I wasn't feeling particularly tired, but something about the dark woods around us, the dense shadows cast by our flashlights, made me uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly. It was just a weird feeling, like the forest was watching us. I shrugged it off. I figured I was just tired from the hike. Around 9 p.m., the others were still laughing and telling stories by the fire, but I decided to head to bed early. I told them good night, grabbed my flashlight, and walked the short path back to the tent I was sharing with 2 other scouts. The tent was dimly lit by the glow of my flashlight as I stepped inside. I zipped it shut behind me and settled into my sleeping bag. My friends' sleeping bags were empty. Both of them were still by the fire. I liked the quiet, though. Their voices drifted faintly through the trees, but inside the tent, it was peaceful. The air was cool, and the fabric of the sleeping bag felt soft against my skin. I lay there for a while, staring at the faint shadows dancing on the tent walls. I tried to relax, my body still buzzing slightly from the day's activities. The sound of the forest was all around me, crickets chirping, leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It must have been about 20 minutes after I climbed into my sleeping bag that I started to drift off. My eyelids were heavy, and my breathing had slowed. Just as I was on the verge of sleep, I felt it, a soft tapping on the top of my head. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. The touch was so light it could have been my hair brushing against the tent fabric. I stayed still, unsure if I should open my eyes or just ignore it. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, I was sure it wasn't in my imagination. My heart started to race. My first thought was that one of the other scouts was messing with me. Maybe they had come back early from the fire and were trying to freak me out. I reached up instinctively to swat at whatever was touching me, but my hand met nothing but air. The tapping stopped for a moment, and I lay there, completely still, listening for any sound outside the tent. The forest had gone eerily quiet. The crickets were no longer chirping, and even the faint rustling of leaves had stopped. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to call out to the others, but my throat felt tight. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe a branch from a nearby tree was brushing against the tent. And then it started again. Top, top, top. This time, I noticed something strange. Whatever was tapping me didn't feel hard like a stick or a branch. It was soft, almost fleshy. The kind of soft that makes your stomach twist because you know it's not normal. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, maybe? A raccoon or a possum. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to give it a reason to stick around. The tapping lasted for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only 20 seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. My ears strained for any hint of movement, any rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was over, that whatever it was had moved on. But the fear had already settled deep in my chest, and sleep was out of the question. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, every nerve in my body on edge. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually, I heard footsteps approaching. For a moment, my heart stopped, but then I recognized the voices. My tent mates were finally coming back from the fire. They unzipped the tent, laughing about something, and climbed inside. I didn't say anything about what had happened. I didn't want to sound like a scared little kid. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what I would have told them. Something soft was tapping my head? It sounded ridiculous, even to me, so I kept quiet and let them settle into their sleeping bags. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though I barely slept. Every little sound outside the tent had me on edge, and I kept replaying the strange tapping in my mind. When morning finally came, I was the first one out of the tent. The sunlight filtering through the trees was a welcome sight, and the chirping birds made the night before feel like a bad dream. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Just a few feet from our tent, in the soft dirt, were tracks. They weren't human tracks, and they weren't from any animal I could easily recognize. They were large, with long, deep impressions where claws had pressed into the ground. I stared at the tracks, my stomach churning. They led away from the tent and into the dense forest, disappearing among the trees. I never told anyone about the tracks either. Even now, I'm not sure what they belonged to. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe it was something else. Whatever it was, I'll never forget the way it felt. Soft and deliberate, like it knew exactly what it was doing. That camping trip was the last one I ever went on. Even now, years later, I can't sleep in a tent without remembering that night and the strange tapping on my head. I don't think I ever will. I don't know if you've ever had one of those nights where your brain plays tricks on you, but I sure did that night in Argentina. The kind of night where your imagination grabs hold of every sound, every shadow, and twists it into something much worse. It was probably nothing but nerves, exhaustion, and isolation that got to me, but let me tell you, it felt real. Too real. I was traveling alone on my motorcycle, far off the beaten path. That's how I liked it, just me, my bike, and the open road, or sometimes no road at all. There's a certain freedom in being out there, with no one to answer to, no itinerary, and no schedule except the sun rising and setting. I'd been on dirt roads most of the day, the kind of roads that aren't on any map. They wound through the countryside, flanked by wide open fields and the occasional grove of trees. By the time I realized I should find a spot to stop for the night, the sun was already dipping low, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. I spotted a river cutting through the landscape and figured it'd make a good place to camp. Water's always a smart choice when you're out in the wild. It's good for cooking, washing up, and just having around. The dirt path I was on led me close enough, and I found a clearing near the bank. It was quiet, peaceful, and remote. Perfect. Setting up camp was quick. I'd done it 100 times before, so pitching my small tent and getting a fire going was second nature. By the time the flames were crackling, the world around me had gone completely dark. No streetlights, no towns in the distance, just the faint glow of the stars above and the sound of the river flowing nearby. I cooked up a simple meal over the fire, something easy, a can of beans and some bread. Nothing fancy, but it filled me up. The firelight flickered on the surrounding trees, casting long, shifting shadows. I remember thinking how quiet it was, how the kind of silence you find in the middle of nowhere is so much deeper than what you get in the city. There's no hum of distant cars, no murmur of voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the call of a bird. At least that's how it was at first. As the fire died down and I started thinking about turning in for the night, I began to hear something, a sound that didn't fit. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, a faint rustling in the bushes on the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that it was the wind, but the air was completely still. Then I thought maybe it was a small animal like a raccoon or a possum, rooting around for food. I ignored it, stoking the fire a bit to keep it alive. But the sound didn't stop. It came and went, soft but deliberate, like something was moving just out of sight. I sat there, staring into the darkness, trying to spot whatever was making the noise. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but black. Then I heard it, a deep, heavy exhale, like air being forced out through a large nose. It was loud, unmistakable, and close. My heart started pounding. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a cow or a horse from a nearby farm had wandered down to the river. That made sense, didn't it? But the sound didn't stop. Another exhale, this one closer, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves and twigs. I scanned the edge of the clearing, my eyes straining against the dark. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there, circling me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but where would I go? The fire was my only light, and beyond that was pitch black. I grabbed my flashlight from my pack and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped the moment I turned it on, like whatever it was knew I was looking for it. I kept the light on, scanning back and forth, but all I could see were the trunks of trees and the undergrowth. Finally, I forced myself to move. I doused the fire, leaving just enough embers to keep it alive, and crawled into my tent. It wasn't much of a shelter, just a thin layer of fabric between me and the outside world, but it felt better than sitting out in the open. I zipped the tent shut and sat there, flashlight in hand, listening. The sounds continued, more rustling, more footsteps, and every now and then that deep nasal exhale. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. I lay down, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just my imagination, just my brain overreacting. I repeated it like a mantra. It's nothing. It's nothing. It's nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the tent fabric. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, everything looked so normal it was almost laughable. The river sparkled in the morning light, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the fire pit still smoldered faintly. For a moment, I wondered if I dreamed the whole thing. Then I saw them, donkeys, a whole group of them grazing near the riverbank. They were just standing there, minding their own business, but the moment I stepped out, a few of them turned their heads to look at me. Big, dark eyes, long ears, and those heavy noses. I laughed, half out of relief and half at the absurdity of it all. It had been donkeys, not a predator, not some unseen threat, just a group of harmless animals wandering around in the dark. Still, they had scared the absolute hell out of me. As I packed up my camp and got ready to hit the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of how real the fear had been. My mind had taken those sounds and turned them into something far worse than what they were. It was a reminder, I guess, of how isolation and darkness can mess with you. I rode off later that morning, the donkeys still grazing by the river. They didn't even glance up as I passed by, like they'd forgotten all about me, but I hadn't forgotten them. There's something about the woods that always gets to me. Maybe it's the silence. Not the normal, everyday quiet, but the kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath. I love it and hate it at the same time. My wife and I had been talking about going camping for weeks, and with the fall weather settling in, we decided to go on a whim. Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas was our pick, mostly because it wasn't too far from home and had a decent reputation for good trails and peaceful campgrounds. We didn't have much time to prepare since it was a last-minute decision. By the time we arrived, the park was packed. The regular campsites were all taken, leaving us with one option: the horse camp. I'd never stayed at a horse camp before, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea. Horses meant noise, smell, and the possibility of stepping in something unpleasant. But we didn't have a choice if we wanted to stay, so we took the spot and set up our tent in the late afternoon. The campsite wasn't bad, really. It was tucked away from the main loop, with a decent amount of trees separating the sites. It felt quiet, even though there were trailers parked nearby for horse owners who had set up camp earlier. Oddly enough, the spots on either side of us were still empty. I figured the campers were running late or maybe had canceled their reservations. It didn't bother me much. Having more space was a bonus. After setting up, we spent the rest of the afternoon hiking one of the shorter trails. The crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching under our boots made it feel like we'd made the right decision coming out here. By the time we got back to the site, the sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the campground. The sites next to us were still empty. It gave the area an almost eerie stillness. We cooked dinner over the campfire, a couple of hot dogs and some baked beans. Nothing fancy, but it hit the spot after a day of hiking. The fire crackled and popped as we sat in our camp chairs, sipping on cheap beers and staring up at the stars. It was the kind of night you hope for when you go camping: cool, calm, and quiet. Eventually, we crawled into the tent and settled in for the night. Our tent was small but cozy, just big enough for the two of us and our gear. I slept on the side closest to the tent wall, with my wife near the center. The sounds of the forest were soothing, a mix of chirping crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I fell asleep quickly, feeling safe and content. I woke up to the sun streaming through the thin fabric of the tent. For a moment, everything felt normal. My wife was still asleep beside me, her soft breathing the only sound. I stretched and turned my head toward the tent wall. That's when I saw it. A dark, muddy imprint smeared across the corner of the tent. At first, I couldn't process what I was looking at. I sat up and leaned closer, my heart sinking as I recognized the shape. It was a hoof print, big and unmistakable, pressed into the fabric where my head had been all night. The corner of the tent was sagging, pushed down into the damp ground. Mud and debris clung to the material. My stomach turned. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to wrap my head around how close I'd come to serious injury, or worse. A horse had stepped on the tent, right where I'd been sleeping. The fabric was crumpled but hadn't torn. If the animal had pressed down any harder, the weight could have crushed my skull. The thought made my chest tighten. I crawled out of the tent, my movements careful and slow so I wouldn't wake my wife. Outside, the campground looked different in the daylight. The sites on either side of us were no longer empty. Two large trailers had parked overnight, their horses now tied to hitching posts a short distance away. The animals were calm, standing quietly as they swished their tails at flies. The owners were nowhere to be seen. I scanned the area, half expecting someone to come over and explain what had happened, but no one did. I glanced back at our tent, the hoof print glaring at me like a warning. How had I not heard it? The noise, the weight pressing down. It should have woken me up, but I'd slept through it all, oblivious to the danger. After breakfast, we decided to pack up and leave. My wife noticed the hoof print while we were breaking down the tent, her face going pale when I explained what had happened. Neither of us felt like sticking around after that. The thought of spending another night there, knowing how easily things could have gone wrong, was too much. As we drove out of the campground, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. Nothing was there, of course, but the feeling stayed with me. Even now, I can't shake the image of that muddy hoof print. It's a reminder of how close we came to disaster, and how fragile that sense of safety can be. Another time, I went camping with a buddy of mine in the Arkansas woods. It was the night before deer season opened, and the forest was alive with the anticipation of hunters setting up their spots. We'd picked a secluded area far from the main trails, a place where we wouldn't be disturbed. The night started off uneventful. We built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and talked about the upcoming hunt. The forest around us was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the trees are listening. I remember staring into the fire, the flickering light casting long shadows that danced across the ground. At some point during the night, a loud crack shattered the stillness. It sounded like a tree branch snapping, the kind of sound that makes your heart jump into your throat. The noise came from somewhere behind us, deeper in the woods. We froze, straining to listen. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see anything, and the darkness beyond was impenetrable. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. We tried to laugh it off, blaming the noise on the wind or an animal. But the tension lingered, a gnawing unease that settled in my chest. Later, as we were dozing off, something small darted through our camp. It moved so fast I barely caught a glimpse of it, a blur of fur and frantic energy. Before I could react, the woods erupted in chaos. A pack of coyotes tore through the underbrush, their yipping and howling echoing all around us. They were chasing whatever had run through our camp, their movements swift and ruthless. Then we heard it, the scream. It was high-pitched and raw, a sound filled with terror and pain. The coyotes had caught their prey, and they weren't wasting any time. The noise went on for what felt like an eternity, the cries growing weaker with each passing second. Finally, silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Neither of us spoke. What could we say? The reality of the wild had unfolded right in front of us, brutal and unforgiving. It wasn't the first time I'd heard animals hunting in the night, but being so close to it, hearing the struggle and the end, it was something I'll never forget. By morning, the forest felt different. The light filtered through the trees, soft and golden, but it didn't erase the memory of the night before. We packed up our gear in silence, the weight of what we'd experienced hanging over us. As we walked back to the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching us, waiting for the next story to unfold. Sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can't explain, they're the ones you can. The trip started like any other. A group of coworkers and I decided to break away from the grind of daily life and spend the weekend camping and kayaking by the river. We had all been talking about this for weeks. It wasn't often we had the chance to get out in nature, away from phones, deadlines, and emails. We arrived at the campsite a little past noon. The air was humid, the sun blazing above us as we unloaded our gear from the cars. The site was tucked away near a bend in the river, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. There were a few other campers scattered around, but the area was largely quiet, exactly what we'd hoped for. By 1 p.m., we had everything set up, tents pitched, firewood gathered, and the kayaks ready to launch for the next day. We cracked open a few beers to celebrate our early productivity. The day stretched out lazily, a perfect summer afternoon. That's when the first strange thing happened. A red truck, an old, beat-up thing with peeling paint, pulled into the small parking lot near our campsite. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe it was another group of campers or someone scouting for a fishing spot. But instead of parking, the truck drove slowly down toward the edge of our campsite, paused, and then turned around without stopping. Lost, maybe. One of my coworkers suggested with a shrug. It was odd, sure, but not alarming. We went back to our conversation and didn't give it much thought. As the day turned to evening, we settled around the fire. The light faded, and the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin. We roasted hot dogs and marshmallows, swapping stories and laughing louder as the drinks flowed. It was one of those moments where you forget the outside world even exists, until we saw the headlights. It was close to midnight by then. Most of the surrounding campers had gone quiet for the night, the only sounds being the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. The beams of light cut through the trees, jolting us out of our comfortable haze. We turned our flashlights toward the parking lot. There it was again, the same red truck from earlier. It hadn't been there all day, so whoever it was had driven back hours later. We froze, unsure of what to do. The truck idled for a moment, its headlights glaring into the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it reversed and sped off, its tires kicking up dust and gravel. Something about it set my teeth on edge. It wasn't just that they'd come back. It was the way they lingered, like they were watching us. None of us said it outright, but the unease was palpable. A few of the guys grabbed their weapons, a mix of hunting knives, an axe, and a couple of heavy flashlights, and decided to check the gate at the entrance to the campsite. It wasn't locked when we arrived, but it had a chain and padlock hanging loosely from it. We walked down the gravel path together, our flashlights cutting through the pitch black. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When we reached the gate, we pulled it closed and secured the chain. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it would at least slow them down. Back at camp, the mood had shifted. The easy laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by quiet murmurs and darting glances into the dark. We kept the fire burning bright and took turns staying awake, just in case. Morning came slowly. The rising sun chased away some of the tension, but the events of the night lingered in our minds. We were packing up for a morning paddle when we heard voices approaching. It was a couple of cops, their uniforms crisp and badges gleaming in the early light. They explained they were patrolling the area after noticing the gate was closed. When we told them about the red truck, their expressions darkened. "This area's got its share of problems," one of them said. "A lot of isolated campsites like this attract the wrong kind of people. It's good you closed the gate. It might have stopped something worse from happening." They didn't elaborate, but the implication was clear. Someone had likely been scouting us out, looking for an opportunity to rob or worse. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but the incident stuck with me. It wasn't the kind of fear that fades quickly. It was the kind that lingers, gnawing at the edges of your mind. Now, every time I think about camping, I remember the red truck and the sense of being watched. I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't closed the gate or if we hadn't been alert. It was a reminder of how vulnerable we are out in the wild, away from the safety of locks and walls. Nature may be beautiful, but the real danger often comes from people. We set out on the trip to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful spot outside Asheville, North Carolina. It was my idea, an escape into nature, away from the constant buzz of the city. My girlfriend at the time, now my ex, had reluctantly agreed. She wasn't the outdoorsy type, but I had talked it up enough that she gave in. I promised it would be a fun getaway. When we arrived at the campground, the park ranger greeted us. He looked like he'd been doing this for decades. Grizzled, sun-worn face, and a demeanor that was friendly but firm. He handed us a small map of the area, circled our designated campsite, and rattled off a list of warnings. He mentioned the usual stuff: fire safety, leave no trace, and respecting wildlife. But one thing he emphasized stood out. "This is bear country," he said. "You need to keep your food locked up in your car and use the bear-resistant trash cans provided. Make noise if you encounter one. It'll usually scare them off." I nodded, mentally cataloging everything he said. My girlfriend, on the other hand, was scrolling through her phone, only half listening. She rolled her eyes at the bear talk. "That's just to scare tourists, right?" she whispered to me after we left. I shrugged. I wasn't about to take chances. That first night, we kept it simple. We set up our tent and decided to head back to Asheville for dinner and some beers. The drive back to town was quiet and scenic, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to go on forever. By the time we returned to the campsite, it was dark. The stars were out in full force, something I rarely saw back home. We fell asleep quickly, lulled by the distant sounds of crickets and owls. The second night, we stayed at the campsite. I wanted the full camping experience, cooking over an open fire, sitting under the stars. I grilled up some burgers while she poked at the fire with a stick, occasionally complaining about the smoke. When we finished eating, I meticulously cleaned up. I wasn't about to leave food scraps lying around. I scrubbed the cookware, locked it in the trunk, and made sure every bit of trash went into the bear-resistant bin. My girlfriend teased me for being so thorough. "You're acting like we're in the middle of Alaska or something," she said. "Better safe than sorry," I replied. We went to bed early, tired from the day's activities. The tent was cozy, the sleeping bags warm. I fell asleep almost instantly. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a faint noise. It sounded like something rustling outside. I lay still, listening. Probably just a raccoon, I told myself. I was about to drift off again when my girlfriend shook me. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah, it's probably nothing," I muttered, half asleep. "No, it's something big," she insisted. Her voice had a tremor in it. I sat up and strained to hear. The rustling had stopped, but there was a new sound now. Heavy breathing, low and deep, just outside the tent. My heart started pounding. My first instinct was to stay quiet, but then I remembered what the ranger had said. "Make noise," I whispered to her. "What?" she hissed back. "Make noise. It scares them off." I started talking loudly, asking pointless questions, raising my voice to sound confident. She grabbed my arm and tried to shush me, but I kept going. The breathing stopped, and after a few tense moments, we heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving away through the woods. We didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. When morning finally came, we emerged from the tent, exhausted but relieved. The campsite looked undisturbed, except for a few overturned rocks near the fire pit. No big deal, I thought, just a curious animal. We packed up our gear and loaded everything into the car. As we drove away, the sunlight streaming through the trees, my girlfriend suddenly leaned forward in her seat. "Why is there a footprint on your window?" she asked. "What are you talking about?"
I glanced over her, confused.
She pointed at the passenger side window, where the sunlight was hitting it just right. I pulled over to take a closer look. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then, as I adjusted my angle, it came into focus. A faint but unmistakable outline of a paw print. And not just any paw print. It was massive, far too big for a dog or any small animal. "Is that a bear?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. I stared at the print, my mind racing. How close had it been? Had it circled the car while we slept? We both sat there, stunned. Eventually, the absurdity of it all hit us, and we started laughing. It was the kind of nervous laughter that comes after a near miss, when you realize how lucky you've been. The rest of the drive was quiet. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we got back home, I couldn't stop thinking about that print. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable we were out there, how easily things could have gone wrong. After that trip, I never went camping with her again. Not because of the bear, but because of everything else that came after. Life happened and we went our separate ways. But every now and then, when I catch a glimpse of the mountains or hear a story about bears, I think back to that night, and I always lock up my food